we're hopeful that this webinar will at least give them a sense of some introduction to the mathematics, to the everyday mathematics, and hopefully alleviate some of that fear and allow them to be, a learning participant, along with their child. And half that battle is becoming familiar with the content.
The other thing I'd throw out there is so much stuff. If you just Google, like, something about math, you'll find all kinds of stuff out there. But our district, and Tony Stam and his team have worked hard to identify really quality resources that are evidence based. And so we want to really make sure parents know where to go to find those kinds of resources.
I think learning math virtually, it can be a challenge, but at the same time, it can also be really reinforcing. I think the challenge happens when there's a disconnect between the way that we would like students to kind of engage with math. Now a little bit different than a lot of us had experienced math as students ourselves, myself included, and that procedural learning where we just learned how to do something a certain way. And when it's presented to us in a different way, we run into a struggle for that. And sometimes that is the best way that some of our community members and families and people at home are helping kids, which is great. It's a great way to connect, but it's not always congruent to what's happening in the classroom, and that leads to some confusion for the student. And so we do want students to learn multiple ways to think mathematically, right? We don't want them just to think in one particular way, like that there's multiple ways to solve a problem or to get to an answer. And it has to do with both mathematically, but also explanation in written form and communicating our thinking in picking up and identifying patterns is all as important as finding the right answer, because that's how the real world works. And so, we're lucky enough nowadays that almost all of us have cell phones in our pocket that have a calculator. So calculation, though is very important in math, is not the be all end all that it used to be when we didn't have those things, accessible to us at all times. So I think it is challenging when we're asking people to think and do things differently than the way that we learned at home, right? And so I think that's where that kind of conflict comes, where parents are doing their very best to make sure that their kids learn and to, learn the way that we learn because we're successful, but knowing that there's a little bit of a conflict as we're trying to get kids to think differently and do math a little bit differently than what we have in the past. So I think it's always critical that kids are staying up to date on their work, regardless if it's math or another content. It's really hard to come back when you are not staying up to date with your teacher and your classmate. As I mentioned, there's lots of opportunities to make up that ground, or in some instances, accelerate beyond the class because you have access that we have never had before in terms of videos and apps and things like that. So it is important. I think it's important for not only academics, but also for the esteem and the way that the child is going to feel in class. If we have to recognize how they're going to perceive themselves as a learner. Ed talked about the phobias and the things that people have perceived beliefs that maybe they're not good at something. We wouldn't walk around saying that I'm just not a good reader. So the fact that we can say, well, I'm just not a good math person it doesn't even come off the tongue right. We have to work on that. So we want kids to feel successful, and we want them to feel a part of their classroom community. And the way that they do that is learning and communicating and having discourse and conversation with their peers in math class. And so it's important to be somewhat in line with getting their work done, as always. And then, teachers are using a variety of ways to track progress. We're using Schoology. We'll have our report cards that will be coming out in elementary. So there will be some progress there. But I think the most important thing is possible is to be able to listen to, your child's thinking and how they get to an answer. The answer might be 9, but how did you get there? And hearing that conversation and hearing the way that they rationalize and think through that is really important. And I'm sure if you guys have some other things that you've talked about with other community members about accessing grades and resources and stuff.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, Tony, that how the children are learning, since March, their mathematics. That's hard uh, to ascertain at this point, but at least I look at that as a disadvantage, knowing that they may have missed out on some key concepts, since March and up to now. However, I find that some students that I've worked with recently, the the kids who you work with on a more personal note, or in breakout rooms, it's there, the positive there is that you're able to, even though there's a disconnect of not having that person to person in person connection, you have the connection that you are sharing your screen with them, so that their visuals are right there in front of them, and the students, and you can bounce questions off of them to find out if they're following you along with you. And you can slow the pace down, in the classroom, and when it's just the general instruction, the teacher's getting from point A to point Z, and then students may be lost by the point at point M. So you're able to work with that student where they are, and then take them a little slower without them feeling like they've been left behind. So I think in this virtual setting, that is an advantage, that you're still able to slow it down for them. However, the I guess the disadvantage would be that they may not be their pace isn't as quick as where it should be. So hopefully that will be made up, when that student becomes more confident in their ability by you taking the time with them or that small group to get the work done.